My name is Mark Pottle, and I'm Isaiah Berlin Legacy Fellow at Wolfson College. And I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to all of you tonight, and to those as well who are joining us online for this evening of discussion, at the centre of which is college's founding president, Sir Isaiah Berlin. Berlin founded Wolfson in 1966, and he served as its first president 1966 until 1975. As well as warmly welcoming you, I would like to warmly thank you, and that is for everyone who's looking online as well. So thank you for coming tonight. Each of you could be somewhere else, but you've chosen to come here and support this event, and we're really appreciative of that. And the event, of course, is a joint book launch to mark, celebrate, participate in the launch of two wonderful new books. Johnny Lyons' Isaiah Berlin and his Philosophical Contemporaries, and Kay Hiruta's Hannah Arendt and Isaiah Berlin. And there are copies that are on sale here this evening, should anybody want to buy one. I'll very briefly set out the programme for tonight. Kay will begin by speaking of his work on Arendt and Berlin. And Maria Dimova-Cookson, who joins us tonight from Durham University, will then give her response to Kay's work. And then that format is repeated, so Johnny will speak to his work, and Henry Hardy will give his response to Johnny's work. That should all take about 50 minutes, so there will be ample time at the end for questions. And I know that nothing would delight the panel more than that there be questions from you, the audience. I can take questions given online as well, and I'll do my very best to get through as many of those in the time that we have at the end. We're due to end at 7 o'clock. And after that, there will be light refreshments in the cafe area just outside. So that's the programme of events. And before I hand over to Kay to begin, I'd just like to say a personal word of introduction to each of us four speakers, and perhaps add something that you won't find if you just Google their names. So I'd like to begin with Kay, who I've known for many years now through his work on Isaiah Berlin. I've come greatly to respect his scholarship and what I see as his really sound, good judgment. And I regard Kay as a very balanced commentator, and I think that's exactly the quality that's needed if one is trying to bring Isaiah Berlin and Hannah Arendt together under one roof, as it were. It's something I think Kay has done superbly well. And in these polarized times when there's a tendency, I think, for all of us to dig in and to entrench, if one wants a lesson, a case study in the value of looking at difference, and also if one wants a study in reconciling opposites, then you couldn't do better than to read the concluding chapter to Kay's work. Johnny Lyons I first knew of when I got a very excited email from Henry Hardy one day back in about 2018. An excited email saying that he'd been sent proofs of a new book on Isaiah Berlin by a scholar who was unknown to him. The scholar was Johnny. And Henry was excited for two reasons. One, the text was really good. And secondly, it was a new and a fresh voice in Berlin studies. And Johnny's book came out as The Philosophy of Isaiah Berlin, and that was published last year. Johnny began his career in political theory at Trinity College Dublin. He left academe to pursue a career in the corporate world. But I think anybody who shares any time or space with him will very quickly realize that his passion is philosophy. And he continued that passion all the time that he was working and raising a family as well, which I find quite remarkable. And that dedication, that commitment has been rewarded with an adjunct professorship at TCD this year. So in a sense, in that aspect of his career, Johnny's career has turned full circle. And I see Johnny as somebody who doesn't just study philosophy, he practices it. It's a tool for him in everyday life, and that comes across very strongly in his books. And also he's got a very good website, which I'd urge you to look at. Maria, I know through her work as one of the two conveners of the Modern Liberty Specialist Group of the Political Studies Association. The PSA exists to promote the study of political theory and political sciences in society. And the idea is it's an adjunct, it's an aid to good government and good politics. And Maria shows a commitment to liberty through that. And I know that's the central one of her research concerns. In the summer, she organised 3 online lectures, one of which Kay spoke, which were really good, and each of them had as its focus liberty. That is one of her research interests. And in 2019, she published an important work, which was Rethinking Positive and Negative Liberty. There's obviously a really strong Berlinian echo there. And of course, Maria is a Berlinian scholar, but she's much more besides. And we're very lucky to have her here tonight, the perfect respondent to Kay. And I'd like to end with Henry Hardy, who I knew for many years before I joined him in 2010 to assist him in editing volumes 3 and 4 of Isaiah Berlin's letters. I was really grateful for that work because it gave me an opportunity, of course, to learn about Berlin. I didn't know much before, but that, in terms of my mental outlook, has been a life-changing experience. But it was wonderful to work with Henry on Berlin and to see how hard Henry's worked over so many years as Berlin's editor and the commitment he's brought to that. And I can attest to the fact that that hard work and that commitment are undiminished in his retirement. We still work very closely together. And Henry's labours have produced a substantial corpus of work. It's a major contribution to political thought and to political theory. And to end my short introduction, I can't illustrate the point I'm trying to make better than to say that without Henry's work, I don't think it's possible that Maria, Kay, and Johnny could have published the works that they've published, certainly in the form that they have. So no Henry, no Maria, no Kay, no Johnny, and actually no us. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Henry. So I just salute his achievement, and I hand over to Kay.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that introduction and also hosting this event at Wolfson. It is a delight to be back here and also a delight to see some familiar faces. I want to begin by telling how I came across this topic, Hannah Arendt and Isaiah Berlin, in the first place, because it has something to do with Wolfson. It goes back to 2008, when I was a graduate student here and accidentally got involved in a small project Henry Hardy was undertaking, which was to edit this booklet that tells the story of Berlin's role in the founding of Wolfson College. My task was to go through Berlin's unpublished papers from the mid-60s and make a photocopy of everything that might be relevant to the booklet project. Back then, I was an overly enthusiastic and utterly inexperienced researcher, and so I estimated that the whole thing could be done in 4 weeks, and excitedly went to what was then called the New Bodleian to examine Berlin's papers. What I didn't know at the time was that if you do archival research, you almost always find some exciting materials that you are not looking for. And that's exactly what happened to me. I stumbled upon a fascinating exchange between Berlin and Bernard Crick, in which they were arguing about Hannah Arendt. As many of you in this room would know, Crick was a distinguished political theorist and one of the first British academics to recognize the importance and originality of Arendt's work. He was on good terms with Berlin, but they often disagreed with each other, and one of the issues they fiercely disagreed over was the merit or lack thereof of Arendt's work. So, by sheer chance, I found myself reading a series of letters between Berlin and Crick. Crick telling Berlin that he should take Arendt more seriously, and Berlin replying that Crick was mistaken about her. I was intrigued by this and photocopied the letters, but I was convinced that there must be a very interesting story behind it. But I was busy with my book or booklet on Berlin, and Wolfson, and I, of course, had my doctoral studies to complete. I therefore had to put aside the Berlin Creek correspondence that I photocopied and went back to my booklet and then to my DPhil. When I finally finished writing my doctoral thesis in 2011, I knew what to do next. Go back to the Bodleian and find out what was going on between Arendt and Berlin. And that was in 2011. 10 years later, this book came out. So that's the short history of how this book came into being. And I'm going to now read from the book itself to give you an idea of what the book is like. And I shall begin with a short quotation. I do indeed have views on Miss Arendt. I am a profound non-admirer of both her work and her personality. She knew this. This is how, in the winter of 1992, then 82-year-old Isaiah Berlin began his reply to a writer who was preparing a monograph on Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. The writer, the late Elisabeth Ettinger, was naturally intrigued. She sent several more letters to ask Berlin to elaborate on his views, share anecdotes, and arrange a meeting with her. Unfortunately for Ettinger, a meeting did not materialize because of Berlin's illness. Fortunately for later historians, Berlin responded to her request in writing and reiterated at once what he had told others on various occasions. He said, among other things, that Arendt was pretentious, self-important, and unsympathetic, that her 1958 book, The Human Condition, showed her wide ignorance of Greek classics, just as her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, displayed comparable ignorance of Russian history, that she sharply and irresponsibly changed her mind about Zionism, and that she expressed, quote, unbelievable arrogance in telling the Jewish victims of the Nazis how they should have behaved, unquote, in Eichmann in Jerusalem. Along the way, Berlin referred to Arendt as my bête noire, as he did repeatedly on various occasions. My book is the first comprehensive study of the Arendt-Berlin conflict in all its personal, political, and theoretical aspects. The historical side of the book traces the development of the unfortunate relationship between the two thinkers, addressing the following questions. When and where did Arendt and Berlin meet, and what happened during those meetings? How did the personal conflict between the two emerge? How did Berlin develop his animosity towards Arendt, and she, her indifference and suspicion towards him? And finally, what other interactions did they have apart from their actual meetings? After answering these questions, I move on to a set of theoretical issues that were of common concern to Arendt and Berlin. They include the following. What does it mean for human beings to be free? What is it like for a person to be denied his or her freedom and deprived of his or her humanity? What are the central features of the worst form of unfree and inhumane society known as totalitarianism, and how does this paradigmatically emerge? How should we assess the apparent failure to resist or confront the evil of totalitarianism, such as when one is coerced into cooperating with a state-sponsored mass murderer? And finally, what kind of society or polity ought we to aim to build if we want as many people as possible to be free and live a genuinely human life? In examining Arendt and Berlin's sometimes overlapping, sometimes conflicting reflections on these questions, I do not try to decide which side won, because I don't believe disagreement between thinkers is a sporting competition, a beauty contest, or any other such game. My goal, rather, is to appreciate Arendt and Berlin's ideas better, reading their works against each other so that the tacit assumptions each theorist made and the hidden biases each had can be teased out and critically scrutinized. My book is a decidedly non-partisan book. Of course, while I was writing it, I was asked many times whose side I was really on, because I was told one cannot possibly be neutral vis-à-vis the Arendt-Berlin conflict. In reply, I have always said two things. First, it is pointless to support either side indiscriminately, because both Arendt and Berlin got many things right and many things wrong, albeit in different ways. A more promising approach, therefore, is to assess the two thinkers' individual arguments on their own merits, and that's what I try to do in my book. The other thing to say in reply is that I know I have some prejudices in favor of both Arendt and Berlin. I have spent years reading the works of both, and my intellectual formation has been inseparable from my compulsive interest in them both. Arendt and Berlin are equally my heroes. The two heroes, however, failed disastrously to get along with each other. If you read my book, you will know why this failure happened and what we may learn from it. And on that note, I am afraid I'm going to show you the discount code. And if you order by the 31st of December, you are going to get 30% discount. So go to the publisher's website, and that's the code.
HIR 21.
Yes.
My turn?
Yes.
I'm very excited to be in Isaiah Berlin land, in Oxford, Wolfson College, in the company of Henry, Mark, Johnny, Kay, and all of you Oxford people who have spared your precious time to be here with us. I'm very honored that Kay has invited me to discuss his book, because looking at the endorsements at the back cover, you have the chance to see that, he's very well connected. Okay, but it could be that my background in British idealism and the political philosophy of T.H. Green in particular makes me a suitable commentator for Kay's book. A scholar like T.H. Green straddles Arendt and Berlin to the extent that T.H. Green had one of the best concepts of positive freedom, and I believe Kay says that one very similar to Arendt's, and he also operates and examines different senses of freedom. And this is where Berlin had the edge over Arendt, I would say. Arguably, he has a better study of the significance and interaction between different senses of freedom. So I'll start my talk by sharing my reservations about Kay's project prior to reading his book. So first met Kay at a conference on Berlin in Paris, 2017, and there he gave a paper which covered some of the material of the first substantive chapter of the book. He spoke of the encounters between the two thinkers, and to put it mildly, of Berlin's disapproval of Arendt. I found Kay's project very fascinating, but I had the reservation. I thought it did not portray Berlin in a good light. Berlin did not approve of Arendt personally, politically, philosophically, and he got these wrong. He did not see the full extent of her future prominence, that she was going to arguably surpass him in terms of popularity and influence. More to the point, nowadays we believe she deserves this prominence. She's held in high esteem in academia and is one of the most studied thinkers in undergraduate curriculum. Reading the book, I'm reminded she's such a heroic personality. She took part in the resistance against one of the deadliest regimes ever. From where we stand now in an environment of threat to liberal values and resurgence of populist and authoritarian regimes, Arendt is a scholar we look up to for ideas and arguments. So Berlin also didn't see the similarities between Arendt and himself and the extent to which their legacies would converge. And I think that's something very interesting, the convergence of their legacies. So kind of Kay is observing this, and I think his work is contributing to this convergence of legacies. So Berlin failed to see that when it comes to his and Arendt's legacy, they would be closer to each other than he anticipated. By bringing out Berlin's dislike for Arendt to broad daylight, Kate exposed an aspect of Berlin which sympathetic scholars like me may not wish to popularize. We all make errors, and we should forgive Berlin this one. So does Kay make it up to Berlin? Will Kay's readers grow to develop a deeper interest in Berlin scholarship if they did not have one to start with? I would say yes, because studying these two thinkers together has produced observations and insights that explain our knowledge and understanding of liberty, resistance, political regimes, and humanity. So what Kay's book helps you see is how Berlin and Arendt fill each other's blind spots. So that's my summary of what Kay's book does. He says it better with a more subtle and richer terms, but I think that's the short essence of how these thinkers gel together. They fill each other's blind spots. The ideas put together for a fascinating picture. So I have to say this is an amazing book, and I would say one of the best academic books I have read from cover to cover. Some of the material lends itself to being easy to follow. There's certainly a gossipy scandal element there, finding out why and how they met, and finding out the extent of his dislike for her is, to say the least, intriguing. But it has to be said that the narrative continues to be smooth and easy on the mind, even when Kate turns to philosophical analysis. There is not a boring section in this book. There's not a single paragraph that's not well written, or that is confusing or self-contradictory or heavy to follow. One of the reasons why the narrative of the book works so well is the structure. So the book studies in parallel the two thinkers, and this is done in several respects. So first the life story and the personality of each thinker, then theories of freedom, then theories of totalitarianism. Pinnacle chapter, I would say, is the reaction to the Eichmann trial, and finally their respective fascination with their home country. So Berlin's fascination with liberal Britain and Arendt's with the Republican United States. So the design is excellent. Two things to observe here which add to a very tight plot. The first is that each of these thinkers is unique and special in the way in which their personality, political views, and philosophical ideas are deeply intertwined. So if we take the book and split it into pulling all the Berlin bits in one book and all the Arendt bits in another book, there will be two very good books. But putting these together produces very good insights, because the book is like the perfect jigsaw. How could two people clash in at so many levels? So this makes for a good story. So the consistency of the clashes contributes for a good plot, but the underlying affinities between the authors allows for a very meaningful philosophical analysis. So that has to be pointed out, that the plot is great, but there's depth there, there's philosophical depth. And I think what's behind the philosophical depth is the deep affinity between the two thinkers. So I'm going to focus on two strengths of the book. So the first is, and I've already started speaking about them, the first is the complementarity of the two protagonists, as Kay calls them, and why we should study them together. Basically, 1 + 1 is more than 2 in this case. And also the quality of the narrative. In the end, I'll say a little bit more the quality of the narrative and why is it written so well. So I'll look first at the topic of freedom. That's one place where I can critique Kay. With everything else, I'm just listening and learning yes, catching up, so to say. So freedom is discussed in chapter 3. Kay argues that at the heart of Arendt's and Berlin's disagreement on the nature of liberty, we find the different understandings of the human condition. So that's behind the difference. Different understandings of liberty backed up by different understanding of the human condition. In Kay's reading, Berlin's negative freedom is best explained as a combination of non-interference and ability to choose. He has a nice shorthand definition. Negative freedom is being able to make unforced choices between multiple options. That's a nice tight definition here. And this is linked to Berlin's understanding of the human condition. The negative concept is truer to the essential aspect of the human condition, that the human being is a choice-making creature. That's an important phrase, choice-making creature. This is the essence of humanity for Berlin. For Arendt, we know to be free is to exercise an opportunity for political participation. This reflects her understanding of the human condition. To be human is to be free is to act, and acting is acting in the sphere of the political together with others. So their understandings are significantly different and reflect profound philosophical differences for Berlin. Both freedom and humanity are related, are realized through the capacity to make choice in a fashion that remains true to value pluralism. For Arendt, freedom and humanity are realized through self-disclosure in the context of the political by acting in concert with others. That's fine, but here I will disagree. And by revealing my disagreement, I'll try to show why case comparison between the two thinkers can be productive, and indeed how it has worked for me. I agree with Kay that their favored freedoms covers the space which the other one does not cover, and that basically Arendt doesn't fully understand negative freedom and Berlin doesn't fully understand positive freedom. But in order to explain how this works better, I would suggest an alternative understanding of negative freedom, and I'll critique Kay. So first, I think that Kay, in fact, gives two contradictory summaries of negative freedom. One is the ability to exercise choice between multiple options, and the other is the ability to exercise choice between conflicting possibilities, i.e. choice in the context of value pluralism. So the second is about value pluralism, and I think the choice between options is very different from the value pluralist choice. The value pluralist choice is among values that are incommensurable, it is a tragic choice, it is a high stakes choice. This choice is basically demands the qualities of moral agency. It's based on the ethical and rational insight of the value pluralist, who has better vision than the monist, and it's performed through, courage, strength of will, etc. So we have here the qualities of a moral agency and the ambience of positive freedom. So the value pluralist choice does not capture the essence of Berlin's negative freedom. I think it captures the essence of positive freedom much better. So I won't go in much detail, but basically I'll assemble different features to create an alternative package for what best represents negative freedom. And my short summary is that through the concept of negative freedom, Berlin wants to protect the vulnerable humanity of the human individual. So I think that's the side which is worthwhile emphasizing. So we are particularly vulnerable when we are not morally attuned, not very smart and rational, not very coordinated and able to get our act together. So this is the humanity that negative freedom aims to protect. The humanity of the value pluralist choice is different. This is a proud, confident, morally sound humanity. And this is the humanity of positive freedom. So by articulating negative freedom in this fashion, one can show better where Arendt's blind spot is. What she does not appreciate is the frailty of moral growth, that if you're moralized and shamed, you may never develop the confidence you need to think for yourself and be brave to come out in the public space. I would say Arendt did not see the moral importance of the personal space and the immorality of looking down on people who fall short of expectations. On his side, Berlin did not see that the protection of the private sphere, this sphere of vulnerability, should not be absolute but temporary. It is fine for people to be ordinary, focused on their own well-being, different, experimenting, withdrawn, but there are circumstances where one has to act decisively and single-mindedly. When those around us are exposed to serious threat, stepping out of the private is not a choice between multiple options. It's not a choice we are morally entitled to. At best, it's a tragic choice between doing your duty or saving the life you have had. And to finish this discussion of freedom, I'm going to use one of Kay's good formulations to put things together. This is how he summarizes Berlin on freedom. So the life of a person who does not exercise positive freedom may be impoverished, but the life of a person who does not have a measure of negative freedom is unbearable, in fact, inhumane. And in this sense, negative freedom has primacy over positive freedom. So my take would be the following. So life without positive freedom would not only be, as he puts it, impoverished, it also would be inhumane in the sense of lacking dignity and moral courage. And life without negative freedom would again be inhumane, but in a different way. And his word unbearable is a very good word, because that will be exhausting and crushing life, because you'll never be able to do what you want. You can still be human in terms of maintaining dignity and making difficult choices, because basically one can always have positive freedom, but without negative freedom, you won't be able to to look after yourself. Nobody can live a life entirely dedicated to others. One needs to recharge batteries between public performances, which Arendt couldn't see. It seems that Arendt didn't need to recharge her batteries, but she was an exceptional personality. So I'll say much less on the other topic, on totalitarianism. Again, a fascinating summary of how they differed on their approach to totalitarianism. Lots of interesting detail there. So something that impressed me is that how particular Arendt was about what counts as a totalitarian regime. So only Stalin-era Russia, not Lenin time Russia or post-Stalin Russia. Only Nazi Germany in a specified period in the early 40s, not the other fascist states in Europe. Berlin, on the other hand, took totalitarianism to include all these, and going back in history, the Spanish Inquisition, the Counter-Reformation, even Sparta. So he kind of puts them opposite each other very well. With Arendt, we have the concentration camp society, and with Berlin, we have the totalitarian mind. And there's an issue there, kind of this contrast. He puts it very well. So this is how he asks it: Why did Berlin focus on totalitarian ideas in stark contrast to Arendt's anti-intellectualist approach in the origins of totalitarianism? And yes, it made me wonder why Berlin didn't like ideas. Why did he blame ideas? Accuse ideas of leading to totalitarian regimes. Here, Kate turns to Berlin's study of Russian intellectual history and quotes Berlin saying, "To my Russian origins, I think I owe my lifelong interest in ideas." So again, against this backdrop, it is still more puzzling why was he so suspicious about ideas. And my kind of comment here, not challenging Kay, but challenging Berlin, would be that, say I disagree with Berlin, and that the fascination with ideas has ethical component, and Berlin's own fascination with ideas is exemplary in this respect. So his engagement brings them to life, and it was an extrovert engagement. Berlin was an entertainer, not only personally, but philosophically. Berlin would do anything to keep audience awake. So his engagement with ideas has an element of virtuosity. It's brave, full of civic spirit, indeed, intended on acting in concert with others on conditions of equality. So one explanation that comes to mind that there has to be an element of self-denial here. And later in the book, Kay talks about Jewish self-hatred, trying to explain why Arendt was so harsh on the Jewish people during the Holocaust. So an expression that comes to my mind is Russian self-hatred, in order to explain why Berlin was so suspicious about the negative impact of ideas. So moving now towards some conclusion, going to the novel-like qualities of Kay's book. So it has novel-like qualities. Kay speaks about Arendt and Berlin as the protagonists. In some subtle way, Kay himself is involved in the plot. In the introduction, he makes it clear, and he actually read these words here, that this is a decidedly non-partisan book, and that if there is a bias, he's biased towards both of them because they're his heroes, and his heroes very dramatically will fail to get along with each other. So Kay's impartiality in kind of adjudicating between them is quite impressive. One can feel Kay's personal skill and effort to keep a balance between two feuding giants. At the end of the last chapter, we see Kay visiting Arendt's grave, picking up a pebble with some words there written by a fellow pilgrim admirer, and this personal touch is deeply moving. The book reminds me of the philosophical novels, particularly of the existentialist psychiatrist Erwin Yalom. I don't know whether you've come across his books. When Nietzsche Wept, The Schopenhauer Cure, The Spinoza Problem, very gripping books. Okay, final comment. On how Kay complements the work of these two thinkers. In the conclusion, Kay lists the similarities and differences between the two protagonists. And here's one similarity. Both Arendt's and Berlin's more scholarly writings have attracted the charge that they're not scholarly enough, that they lack the kind of impartiality, precision, rigor, footnotes and references expected of proper academic research. Nobody would accuse Kay of such failure of scholarship. His book shows excellence in all these respects. Single-handedly, he makes up for the shortcomings of his heroes.
Thank
you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being here this afternoon and this evening, and welcome all those who are joining online. I'm honoured to be co-presenting or co-launching my book with Kai, who I've admired for many years. He's one of the top young Berlin scholars, so it's a real honour for me to be launching my book today. And when I read Kai's book, it just confirmed what a distinguished scholar he is. It's a gripping book, it's original, it's powerful. His ability to achieve this equipoise between Arendt and Berlin with such precision and scholarship and provocativeness is a real inspiring lesson and quite humbling. So I'm going to be quite brief. I'm going to say a few words about why I wrote this book, and then I'm going to read from the opening pages to give you a sense of the book's style and tone. My reasons for writing this book were twofold, really, intellectual and... Yes, thanks, Guy. Intellectual and actually even became psychological. But I'd talk mainly about the intellectual reasons I wrote this book. I did publish my first book in 2020, which is called The Philosophy of Isaiah Berlin. And that book really tries to show that Berlin never really gave up philosophy, that he just pursued it by other means. That's not an entirely original claim, but I did try to give it a bit more foundation and also tried to show certain aspects of Berlin's thought, especially his Kantianism, and a bit more about his Vicoism than others had. And I also want to show in that book that he, not just to talk about his liberalism, but also his whole approach to political philosophy, which I think is much more original and much more gripping than many academics, I think, have acknowledged. With this new book, I wanted to, in a way, deepen and widen that perspective. And I felt the way to do that was, the best way to do that was dialectically. In other words, looking at comparing and contrasting Berlin's views as a philosopher, not as a kind of a Cold War liberal or as an impressionistic historian of ideas, but as a philosopher. And I wanted to compare and contrast his ideas with the leading philosophical contemporaries of his time, or near contemporaries. My initial plan really was that that would bring out more clearly his own philosophical ideas. But what emerged as I got more into the task was that the ideas of his philosophical contemporaries emerged more clearly as well. So this kind of approach, which is not dissimilar to Kai's, is that you look at Berlin in the context of another thinkers and see what comes out. And I think it could be quite a fruitful way of studying a thinker. In this book is probably more critical of Berlin than my previous book, which was far more sympathetic. I think in this book I try to show, yes, Berlin's got weaknesses, but I think some of his achievements come out more clearly when you compare them to, for example, to some of the thinkers here. So these are the 6 thinkers I compare his ideas to. And some of them he was very familiar with and knew himself, like Austin, Ayer, Strawson, Bernard Williams, and Quentin Skinner. So that's who it compares itself with. So, I mean, they were the reasons I did it. I think the book ended up being quite different than I thought it would be when I started off, and I quite enjoyed that. The psychological reason why I wrote the book or was able to finish it was because in 2020 I became unexpectedly unemployed. I won't go into bore you with the details of why that happened, but it happened. And writing this book helped keep me sane. And actually, because I was unemployed for about 7 months or so. So the book helped me, along with my family, but intellectually kept me sane. And for me, this book has almost earned its keep already. It's up to others to decide if it's got any value beyond that. So I'd now like to read this book, the opening pages, to give you a sense of the book itself. So chapter 1, Introduction. No Man is an Island, John Donne, Meditations 17, Devotions upon Emergent Occasions. John Donne's words are as germane to the loner as the art of the socializer. Their truth reveals itself not just in the banal sense, that even the most solitary and isolated among us must rely occasionally on our fellow humans for basic survival. It also discloses itself more unobviously in the way that our very understanding of ourselves and others does not happen ex nihilo. The world into which we are born provides the inescapable context of our thought and conduct, including thoughts about living in hermetic isolation. And one of the deep and paradoxical features of our understanding is that it contains more than one credible and valuable view of the world. The more profound aspect of our sociality is especially rich in meaning, giving rise to several arresting philosophical perplexities. One of the most salient centres on the discrepancy between those of our thoughts which refer to reality as it is independently of us, and those which seek to capture the world as we experience it in our daily lives. In what the German philosopher Edmund Husserl referred to as the Lebenswelt, or life world. The difference is sometimes characterized in philosophical circles as the tension between the view from nowhere and the view from here and now. There are those, for instance, who claim that only science is capable of providing a truly objective and complete account of reality, of adding to the storehouse of unchanging and infallible human knowledge, while others who argue that the truths produced by or derivable from some science do not exhaust all available human understanding and truth. Those in the former category tend to align philosophy with the scientific model and methods of inquiry, while those in the latter are more prone to identifying the discipline in broadly humanistic or at least non-scientific terms. Furthermore, there is much debate and disagreement about what, if any, constitutes the optimal account of the world within, and not just between, the naturalistic and humanistic standpoints. There are evidently various scientific views of the material world, just as there is a multiplicity of non-scientific ways of making sense of the lived reality of human life. This helps explain why the distinguished philosopher Hilary Putnam considered pluralism among the most important and difficult topics of our time, adding, and I quote, "In truth, the difficulty of dealing with pluralism is as much human and political. Learning how to live together in a world in which diversity can no longer be ignored and unity cannot be achieved by the method of authority, as it is intellectual." This volume examines the plurality of different ways of grasping the world and our complex relation to it, in a way that seeks to amplify their distinctively philosophical underpinnings. More specifically, it explores how the various conceptions of philosophy of Berlin, the book's protagonist, and other significant philosophers of our time inform their beliefs about a number of fundamental questions. The questions themselves were important not just to Berlin and his interlocutors, but are among the most difficult and enduring problems of philosophy. They include, is morality objective? What is the nature of philosophy? Do we have free will? Is history indispensable to philosophy? And what, if any, is the basis of a free and tolerant society? Each of these topics is given a chapter, and each chapter considers how Berlin and one of his contemporaries treat it. But, As will become clear, these large and difficult questions are connected to one another in all kinds of fundamental ways. Registering how they are related and emphasizing the importance of these relationships forms a vital component of our inquiry. Berlin and his interlocutors view philosophy as one, rather than a collection of essentially autonomous and specialized elements. They see philosophy as a tree with several necessarily connected and interweaving branches, rather than a bocage landscape of separate self-contained fields and subfields. Seeing philosophy as one does not entail that its various and disparate elements form a pre-existing or coherent whole, or even reconcilable with each other. It suggests only that the different and interlocking parts of the subject are inseparable, and that genuine philosophical discussion tends to be all-consuming. This study grew out of my previous book on Berlin. While working on the philosophy of Berlin, it struck me with increasing force that Berlin's pluralist philosophical vision might assert itself more clearly. That's what I should have said. Against the background of the ideas of a number of his leading contemporaries. What I mean by pluralism here is the claim that there is more than one valid way of understanding the world, that there exists a diversity of cognitively meaningful yet competing pictures of reality and our relation to it. This notion of philosophical or epistemological pluralism grounds Berlin's more explicit and celebrated idea of value pluralism, which claims that there exists a plurality of irreducibly heterogeneous and conflicting human values and ways of life. Unearthing Berlin's deeper philosophical pluralism makes possible a better understanding of his more renowned value pluralism. It also enables us to see that while his seemingly unconnected intellectual interests and ideas may not all be of a seamless piece, they are more of a piece than is commonly recognized in academic circles. Berlin is a systematically unsystematic thinker, but for strongly philosophical reasons. By the time that book was completed, I had arrived at a further discovery, namely that the central views of a number of Berlin's eminent philosophical contemporaries could be examined more productively in the light of his thought. A comparative study can prompt us to peel back the layers of each thinker's outlook in interesting ways and get closer to the heart of their thought. The result is that we don't just get an intriguing insight into the worldviews of 6 influential philosophers, but we achieve a better grasp of philosophy as a whole, one that changes our sense of what is philosophically possible and worthwhile. This is, of course, no accident. A common trait of authentic philosophers is their tendency not to suffer from the hubristic delusion that they are bigger and better than the subject itself. With perhaps one exception, each of the thinkers featured in this study provides a greater sense of the profound reality and difficulty of each of the big questions that are discussed, and of the space a recognition of their reality and difficulty creates for a freer and more fruitful intellectual inquiry. Thus, in an apt way, the book ends up being less about Berlin and his interlocutors and more about the point and value of philosophy itself. It is also one that leaves us with far more questions than answers. This too feels right, since it resonates with the distinction Berlin was fond of making between an intellectual and a member of the intelligentsia. Whereas intellectuals are comfortable with the idea that there are more genuine questions in the world than conclusive answers, the intelligentsia's members, he argues, are committed to the idea that a real question is bound to have a definitive answer. Berlin felt that philosophers belonged very much to the first group. His own preoccupations with several of philosophy's most intractable problems led him to carve out new intellectual spaces and adopt a different style of philosophical expression so that he could do greater justice to the richness of these problems. He was keen to write about human affairs in a new and different register that would in turn prove capable of revealing new and worthwhile insights. His mode of theorizing succeeded in showing us that a more realistic and imaginative concern with philosophy's problems, rather than their alleged solutions, can lead us to change how we conceive philosophy and its relation to the world. Nowhere is this more evident than in Berlin's readiness to challenge some of our most potent assumptions and doctrines of orthodox philosophical thinking, and to affirm where appropriate the lessons and authority of the world of common human experience in opposition to the received wisdom of much of traditional and contemporary philosophy. And yet what emerges from Berlin's writings is less an anti-philosophical diatribe than a refreshingly honest and incandescent philosophical outlook, one which encapsulates the sentiment in the opening section of David Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And I quote, "Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy, be still a man." Thank you.
Anyone who reads Johnny Lyons on Isaiah Berlin and his philosophical contemporaries will quickly realize that Johnny is a true philosopher through and through. He lives and breathes philosophy, and it keeps him awake at night, just as it didn't keep Isaiah Berlin awake at night, which is one of the reasons he used to give for allegedly switching from philosophy to the history of ideas. Johnny is also terrifyingly well read. Where does he find the time, especially given his full-time unphilosophical job? And what he writes is continuously dense, serious, subtle, sophisticated, and nuanced, so that any attempt to summarize what he has to say is doomed to be a caricature. Johnny has also invented a new franchise, a fertile new franchise with almost limitless possibilities of expansion, namely the comparative study of Berlin and other philosophers. I know that he contemplates at least one more book along the same lines with a different supporting cast. Kay is snapping at his heels with his brilliant comparative study of Arendt and Berlin. But since this has a cast of only two, like David Coates' 2013 study, Isaac and Isaiah, it is perhaps not a true sequel. But both Johnny's and Kay's books illustrate the plurality of philosophical personalities and the widely but not universally recognized truth that philosophical beliefs are as much the product of individual temperaments as they are of a search for truth. Connectedly, Johnny believes that philosophical questions are to some extent more important than philosophical answers, that to travel philosophically is better than to arrive at clear solutions to philosophical puzzles. I am not myself persuaded by this defeatist view, though of course one cannot achieve satisfactory solutions without first clarifying the questions. I have often wished that Ludwig Wittgenstein had written a book called not Philosophical Investigations, but Philosophical Results. Johnny looks at 5 philosophers whose lives overlapped with Berlin's and pairs each of them with a specific philosophical topic. This yields 5 main chapters, each comparing the views of Berlin and one of his contemporaries on a single question. So we have Berlin and Freddie Ayer on Is Morality Objective? Berlin and John Austin on What is Philosophy? Berlin and Peter Strawson on Do We Have Free Will? Berlin and Quentin Skinner on Is Philosophy Historical? And Berlin and Bernard Williams on What is the Basis of a Free Society? I have time only to pick one ingredient in each of Johnny's comparisons and to make one brief, I hope provocative comment upon it. We begin then with Freddie Ayer, whose emotive theory of ethics claims that statements about morality are in fact just expressions of emotional attitudes, the boo-hurrah theory as it has been called. I have never for a minute been tempted by this theory, and I am amazed that anyone else has, unless under the spell of a blinding ideological commitment to an impermeable Humean divide between facts and values. As it happens, Kay quotes a paraphrase by Berlin of Hume's view on this divide. Quote, mere inspection of what happens in the world reveals no purpose, dictates no ends, establishes no values. Berlin continues, what is does not entail, either strictly or even in some vague and indirect fashion, what ought to be. End of quote. As Kay observes, Berlin does not entirely endorse Hume's account. Still less do I. My provocative suggestion here is that our ends and the values based on them are facts about the world, no less than what are normally regarded as so-called scientific facts. It is a fact that human beings pursue certain ends, and that they value the pursuit of at any rate some among these ends as being beneficial to their kind in virtue of its needs and desires. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of by natural scientists, including the intentions and purposes of human beings, which are distinctively recognized by the humanities. And Berlin incorporates this truth into his account of the objective pluralism of values and cultures. Next comes John Austin with his view that minute analysis of everyday language can clarify and indeed to some degree answer many, if not all, philosophical problems. He is sometimes caricatured as an extreme linguistic conservative, holding that existing concepts have evolved over a long period to be exactly fit for purpose, so that it is a rash person who attempts to adjust meanings prescriptively. In a frequently quoted passage, he observes that, quote, our common stock of words embodies all the distinctions men have found worth drawing and the connections they have found worth making in the lifetimes of many generations, unquote. What is less often quoted is a passage a little later in the same essay in which he writes that, quote, ordinary language is not the last word. In principle, it can everywhere be supplemented and improved upon and superseded, unquote. Berlin's conception of philosophy as dealing with the strange questions not covered by the empirical and formal domains, questions that give us what Wittgenstein called mental cramp, such as, what is time? Is very different from Austin's. But there is an echo of Austin in his repeated insistence that one of the most important philosophical abilities is to tell apart words about words and words about things. Characteristically, Berlin does not give anything like a formal account of what this distinction amounts to, which may remind us of what Wittgenstein once wrote to Bertrand Russell about G.E. Moore. Quote, unclear statements don't get a bit clearer by being repeated, unquote. I wish I had asked Berlin to give me a clear account of what he meant, with clear examples of each party to the distinction. My suspicion is that there exist no completely pure examples of either. Nevertheless, one does understand roughly what Berlin means, and my provocative suggestion here is that large parts of the philosophical literature about liberty or freedom consist of words about words masquerading as words about things, so that we mistake a discussion of language for a discussion of the nature of the world, and waste time on arid terminological disputes at the expense of substantive inquiry. Peter Strawson's way of dealing with the incompatibility between determinism and free will was effectively to suggest that we carry on as if determinism isn't true, even though it probably is. This strikes me as a pretty clear trahison d'éclair, an evasion of truth, a sort of sophisticated fudge. Berlin took the more straightforward view that determinism and free will were fully incompatible, and that an acceptance of determinism would destroy large tracts of our language, including the ideas of praise, blame, and responsibility. He didn't deny the truth of determinism, but he wanted us to be honest about its implications. I am on Berlin's side. Moreover, even if we accept that determinism is true, as I believe it may be, we are constitutionally unable to live the acceptance of its implications. We cannot escape the illusion that we are free. There is, of course, something deeply paradoxical about accepting an illusion in the awareness that it is indeed an illusion. But this seems to be more psychologically manageable for us, for some reason, than accepting the logical consequences of the illusoriness of our belief in free will. Quentin Skinner, at least in the early phase of his career, argued that it is grossly anachronistic to study thinkers of the past as if they were our contemporaries. They occupied a different stage in the history of thought, and so had different assumptions, different agendas, and different concepts. Therefore, it is deeply mistaken to engage with them without taking these differences into account. Differences that often eliminate any apparent overlap between the concerns of different eras. Later, he accepted that there is a certain area of common ground between past and present, and this concession weakens, perhaps critically, his objection to ahistorical accounts of the ideas of earlier thinkers. Berlin accepted the principle underlying Skinner's critique, but insisted that even when the peculiarities of past intellectual contexts are taken into account, there is still sufficient continuity between past and present preoccupations to allow us to engage in a sensible conversation with past thinkers. As he wrote to Skinner, quote, "I cannot deny that what interests me most are the ideas which still seem to me to be living, hairs that are still running, issues that are of permanent concern, at least of lasting concern, to other societies." End of quote. To the extent that Skinner's insights still pose problems for Berlin's style of intellectual history, my provocative suggestion here is that if anachronism is the price paid for a stimulating reaction to earlier thinkers, it may sometimes be a price worth paying. A punctilious fidelity to the historical specificities of writings of the past can paralyze attempts by later thinkers to respond constructively and creatively to those writings. There may be a kind of pluralist incommensurability between historical accuracy about and interesting engagement with thinkers of the past, and it is by no means self-evident which one should prefer. Johnny's final comparison is with Bernard Williams, who is closest to Berlin of all 5 contemporaries. So part of the emphasis in this chapter is on similarities rather than differences in their attitudes to the foundations of liberalism. One thing they were both concerned with is what Johnny calls, quote, "the academic debate regarding the logical relation and compatibility of pluralism and liberalism," unquote. This debate was inaugurated by George Crowder in a 1994 article, arguing that pluralism undermines liberalism by showing that it can only be one option among many, which can claim no superior status. Berlin and Williams wrote a reply jointly, which I find not too convincing. Johnny calls the debate, quote, "a distinctly jejune affair," unquote, adding that, quote, "the cottage industry that keeps it alive is still bustling," unquote. He proceeds to hurl brickbats at the, quote, "logic chopping sophistry," unquote, involved, calling it, quote, "densely superfluous," unquote. This is part of his general antipathy to analytical philosophy, but it is conducted more at the level of insult than of argument, which to my mind is a mistake. I believe that pluralism does strongly support liberalism, and that it is important to state and clarify the grounds for such a belief. Merely to deride those who take a different view rather than taking the trouble to present arguments against them is a cop-out. Of course, general questions can be raised about the applicability of logic to the realities of human life. But the debate about the relationship between pluralism and liberalism has no special protection against logical argument. I have now thrown my 5 stones into the pool and invite others to throw their stones at me.
I'd like to thank our 4 speakers very much for their contributions. And as I said in the introduction to this evening's event, we're very keen now to take questions from the floor. So if you put your hand up, if you have a question, and I'll point to you. Steve will give you the microphone. If you could please briefly introduce yourself and then address your question.
Hi, thank you so much. This was so much fun and so invigorating. In brief introduction, I guess, I'm a student here at Wolfson studying political theory, and it always makes me very proud to be on the grounds founded by IZIA Berlin. I had a question for, is it Professor Lyons? Well, the book of Kay is a very intimate juxtaposition. You have chosen to include 5 contemporaries, and of course the difficulty one runs into when they expand the field of comparison is where to start and when to stop. So my first question would be, how did you come across these 5, and at what point were you satisfied with the picture you've painted? And secondly, how did you not run into Hannah Arendt in your list of contemporaries to consider?
Okay, well, thanks for the question. Johnny, by the way, is fine. I don't need any professor before my name. I think my selection of the 5 thinkers was very deliberate because I wanted to pick really 5 what I consider top philosophical contemporaries during Berlin's lifetime, or among the top. I mean, I do have question marks about Ayer in terms of his contribution to moral philosophy, but I think in terms of Austin, Strawson, Williams, and Skinner, I think they are fairly, uncontroversially major figures. So that was the first thing. I wanted to test Berlin's ideas against the best. So that was the first thing. I did originally want to write 7 chapters. My original plan was to write a chapter on Berlin and Hart on human rights. And actually I was also playing with the idea of Berlin and Wiggins on the meaning of life. That may be a second volume. But the main point really was, I wanted to say, can Berlin live in the deep end with these thinkers? And what I think it shows is he can. So that was my main kind of thesis. And I think he comes out very well. And I think they come out quite well as well. But you change your view about them. For example, let me give an example of Austin. Before I started this book, I read Austin, and I tended to read, his original book on linguistics. I hadn't read his philosophical essays. When you read those essays, you get a much richer conception of what he was like as a philosopher, much more capacious, He doesn't fit the caricature of an arid linguistic philosopher. And he had much more in common with Berlin than I think we would normally think. I think in that regard, he was taken over by the bottom feeders in the academy, not so much, and wasn't really interpreted in the way he should have been, in a much more inclusive and grand way. And then the second thinker that really emerged really clearly with big similarities with Berlin was Strawson. Unlike what Henry actually portrayed my chapter there, I see a lot more in common between Strawson and Berlin on freedom. I don't see this dichotomy. I think they're much more similar. And I think that it all comes down to their notion of the role of truth and how it plays its role in how we understand and interpret both the natural world and our own human world. And I think when you put truth at the center of the free will debate, then I think their similarities and differences are mutually illuminating. So I do think that what I have to say about Strawson there is original, and also how Strawson helps us understand Berlin. And then I think, finally, I suppose I've always felt that Bernard Williams has been the most faithful successor to Berlin. I mean, you could argue another way that John Gray is as well, another kind of way, but I think for me, Williams is. And the reason is because they put truth and truthfulness at the heart of liberalism. So without truth, we're really snookered. And I think Berlin felt that as emphatically as Bernard Williams did. And I do feel, therefore, that if you do that, you do stop giving up, I think, this intellectual game of treating concepts as if they behave like atoms, rather than treating them as parts of human life. And when you do that, I think you stop thinking about the logical compatibility between liberalism and, for example, pluralism, and you look at the human connections between those terms. And that was the main reason I selected those thinkers. They almost self-selected themselves. Did I answer? Was there another question? Was that it?
Was perfectly. The last question was on if you ran into Hannah Arendt the same way as,
as
he ran into her.
Well, no, I've got to hand it to Kai that I mean, Arendt and Berlin were not who I would consider, they're kind of strange bedfellows, and yet how Kai pulled it off by showing that you could actually illuminate both their ideas without in any way nullifying them. So I think that was a great achievement, this kind of equipoise he achieves between them, while maintaining the authentic ideas of their identity of their thoughts.
Thanks very much, Johnny. And we have another question from the gentleman just here.
Hi, David Miller. Do I have to switch this on?
I think it's already on.
It's on already. So Kai, so you weren't able really to fill us in on what you thought the main points of disagreement were between Berlin and Arendt, but seeing the sort of array of people around Berlin in Johnny's book reminds us that Berlin's original formation was in empirical and analytic philosophy, whereas clearly Arendt's was in a completely different philosophical tradition, German philosophical tradition, Heidegger and Jaspers and so on. So I just wondered whether that made a difference. I mean, whether the fact that they came from such different starting points affected their political thought in a way that made it hard for them to agree.
Thanks for the question. And that's part of the story I'm telling in the book, is how the Arendt-Berlin rivalry relates to a broader story of the so-called analytic continental divide, which happened in the 20th century in the main as well. And this relates to an earlier question about why Johnny didn't include Hannah Arendt in the mix, and that has to be that all of them and Berlin could speak philosophically to each other because they share some common ground, whereas Arendt and Berlin did not share a common ground because they came from very, very different backgrounds. And I think it is important here to recognize that Berlin, even though he did say that he left philosophy and became a historian of ideas and so on, he remained kind of committed to the broadly empiricist outlook, and he never abandoned his disdain for continental philosophy broadly, and especially phenomenology, and more particularly the Heideggerian variant of phenomenology. So one of the tasks for me in writing about Arendt and Berlin is to write about those two people who didn't really share a common ground, and as a result couldn't really understand each other at all. And there is a reason, I think, why Berlin almost always said, that The Human Condition is the worst book by Hannah Arendt. It's not The Origin of Totalitarianism, which he thought was good in some parts. It's not even Eichmann in Jerusalem, even though he was scandalized by that book and he didn't like it at all. But still, he said The Human Condition is the worst book. And that indicates the distance between Arendt and Berlin in terms of their intellectual formation, different languages that they used, and why they couldn't really speak to each other. So part of my book is to try to translate their ideas into my language so that their ideas can be compared by me. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Very brief. Yeah, what you have just said would be the logical, philosophical explanation. But as you also point, I've read, he hated her from the very beginning, first meeting. He hadn't even read her. And there was another point there, which was Zionism, anti-Zionism. So that's also, there is a deep antipathy to Hannah Arendt for, I think, other reasons that are not clear. I don't know if anybody would find out which were the real causes of this deep antipathy, which transcend the political debate, the philosophical debate. I mean, Zionism, anti-Zionism, everything. So I don't know if you still think that there is something else that you couldn't read in your book to understand.
I couldn't, sorry, say it again?
Something else apart from the philosophical distance or continental, empirical, non-empirical, etc., that you couldn't read. Because you point, there was a clear antipathy from the very beginning, and maybe more to do with their Jewish condition than with other philosophical points. Thank you.
Yeah, so there are different layers of difference and lots of reasons for Berlin to dislike Hannah Arendt. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to say we cannot really identify one factor as the ultimate cause to explain Berlin's animosity towards Arendt. Some people have tried to do it, and partly because much of what Berlin had to say about Arendt had been buried in the Bodleian Library, and very few people have bothered to look into the archives. Some people have speculated that his antipathy, animosity towards Arendt must have come from Eichmann in Jerusalem. And what I'm trying to show in the book is, well, that's part of the story, and it's an important part of the story. But long before Eichmann in Jerusalem got published, they met in 1941, not as philosophers, but as some kind of activist, getting involved in Jewish politics, Zionist politics specifically. And their opinions were very, very different. And they met again in 1949. And once again, when they met in 1949, they didn't meet as academics. They met as people who are trying to exercise some influence over real politics. And the philosophical encounter happened after that in 1958. So there are those kind of layers and layers in the story. And so I would resist the idea that there is one factor that can explain the whole of the animosity on Berlin's part. And it's a complicated story, which is why it takes 20,000 words for me to tell the story.
Are there any other questions?
Thanks. I've just got a quick question for both of you, if that's okay. First of all, Kay, I'm interested in the fact that you're obviously taking a biographical approach to the relationship between Berlin and Arendt. And this follows on, I suppose, from the last question. We're all aware of situations in which two people meet and they simply take against each other. And we're not sure why that is. It's something that we can't necessarily understand. Do you think, you've spoken very interestingly about the layers and so on, do you think that was one layer, that they simply did not like each other at all? I mean, I noticed that you referred to Arendt as being suspicious of Berlin, and I'm interested in the degree to which you think, I know you said you can't choose between them, that the antipathy between them was intellectual. Do you think that was the main reason? And I understand you can't reduce it in that sense, but do you think that was the most powerful reason, the intellectual disparity between them?
Well, once again, I don't want to single out one factor as more important than others. I think there are multiple factors that are more or less equally important. But it is true that beyond their political differences, ideological differences, and theoretical differences, their personalities were very, very different. There is no question about that. And I begin with a quotation by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was an important political scientist in the US, and he was the one responsible for their second meeting. So he brought Arendt and Berlin together, and he writes down the impression in his notebook. And then I begin my book with a quotation because I think that nicely captures the kind of temperamental difference that you were talking about. So I'm just going to read out that bit, that quotation. So, years ago, I brought Hannah and Isaiah together. The meeting was a disaster from the start. She was too solemn, portentous, Teutonic, Hegelian for him. She mistook his wit for frivolousness and thought him inadequately serious. So that is temperamental difference, and that's important.
I was interested in the line in your introduction, the very memorable line, that Berlin is perhaps the most systematic of unsystematic thinkers. To what degree would you agree with people like Jason Ferrell and Alan Ryan when they say that part of Berlin's point is his being inconclusive? It's another attack on monism, almost a form of literary modernism in that sense, where the structure of the work is the same as the semantic content, the main semantic content. Would you agree with that to some extent?
Yes, I think that's a very nice way of putting it. And in a way, I think this brings him back actually to Kant, okay? I mean, I think he was opposed to continental thought more in the 20th century, and I think originally probably goes back to Hegel. And that was a kind of a prejudice that was common amongst analytical philosophers. They saw that as the start of this kind of metaphysics in a bad sense. Obscurantism might be another term. But if you go back to, he was very connected with Herzen, who would have been very sympathetic to that view of the world that is necessarily incomplete, necessarily contingent. The idea that there's no final text, and the very idea is not just practically impossible, it's conceptually incoherent. And I think one of the things that I think is not properly realized, or I think he ultimately gets this, you could say from Vico, but I think it's fundamentally from Kant. And he sees Kant's discovery that ultimately we are the interpreters of our world, that we don't have access to the mind-independent world. We know about that from a naturalistic point of view, but when you apply that to our humanistic thoughts, it really does open the gates to contingency, incompleteness, fallibility, inconclusiveness. And you could actually call it a kind of proto-modernism. It's like the wasteland before the wasteland. And in that regard, I think he's both a modernist and a kind of a pre-modernist. And I would locate that as much in Kant as I would in Vico and Herzen. So he's also very European, but he's not European from a continental thinker in a 20th century sense. It goes back further, mainly Russian intelligentsia.
Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
I have a couple of questions that have come through online. And I'd like to thank Viara Latsarova for her question. And it's a question for you, Maria. So the question is, assuming that you have the freedom to speculate based on the essence of Berlin's ideas and philosophical views, in your opinion, how would Berlin comment on one of the very well-known Arendt quotes? And the quote is, "The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution." So what do you think Berlin might have said about that?
I have to think. I have to think about this.
And I'll field the second question. If you have an answer, just jump back in. So this is a question from Dan Gordon, and thank you, Dan, for the question. He says, if time allows, how important do the two authors, Johnny and Kay, think the Jewish background of Arendt and Berlin is for understanding them? And then there's a kind of follow-up question there, which I guess is more for Kay than for Johnny. But that question would be, did Arendt and Berlin have disputes over Israel, the Jewish refugee experience, the nature of anti-Semitism? But if we take that first part of the question, so Johnny and Kay, and perhaps Johnny, you would like to lead briefly and then pass on to Kay. What do you think that the Jewish background, how important is that for understanding Berlin, say? And Arendt, if you know much about her as well.
Yeah, I'll speak with Berlin with slightly more authority than Arendt, so I'll leave Arendt to Kai. I mean, I've got two views about this. I think you can understand Berlin independently. You can understand his thought reasonably independently of his Jewishness, in the sense that I think his ideas transcend that on one level. But on another level, you can't understand him without his Jewish background. I think there's certain aspects of Berlin's thought that are embedded in his Jewishness, his views on Israel, his views on Zionism, his views on nationalism. So that goes without saying. To what extent his Jewishness is critical, for example, to making sense of his defense of liberty, his understanding of history, his interpretation of Herzl or other great thinkers, I have an open mind about that. I would be fairly agnostic on that point. You can bring it in, or if you want, I don't think you have to. I think when you're talking about nationalism, and you're talking about his interpretation of totalitarianism, which I think Kai brings out very well. Well, then you have to bring into account his Jewish background, and obviously, be it biographically, it's indispensable and undeniable. But so I'd have two views on that one.
Okay, can I pass that question to you? Do you want me to repeat it, or do you want to?
I think I remember the question. Yeah, so short answer is it's absolutely central for the story I was after, which is the story about Isaiah Berlin and Hannah Arendt. I don't think you need to think about his Jewish background when you are thinking about different aspects, some aspects of Berlin's work, his empiricism, for example. But if you try to think about Berlin in comparison with Arendt, that aspect is absolutely crucial. And I would have to say, when I began my research, I didn't think it was very important because I thought they were both theorists of freedom. And I thought I was going to write a fairly straightforward political theory book comparing, different theories of freedom. But as I read more, it became clear that you cannot ignore that aspect if you want to tell the story of Arendt and Berlin. Partly because one very important reason why Berlin came to detest Hannah Arendt was because he did not approve of what she said about Zionism and about Israel. It's a very complicated story. I cannot give a summary of it, but I try to tell that story as impartially as I can in the book. So I hope you'll be able to read it.
Can I answer
Maria, of course.
So I want to thank Vera Lazarova for this question. And Vera is somebody I studied philosophy together at Sofia University, so I'm very touched that she's very mean to ask a difficult one. I'm not an Arendt scholar, and I cannot recognize the argument behind this saying. My kind of flippant response would be that I would view Berlin as more on the conservative side of revolution and Arendt as on the revolutionary side, and a quote that brings them together. But thank you, Vera.
I have a slight view of that question, actually, which I would mind sharing.
Please go ahead, John.
When the question was asked, the person that came to mind immediately was Eric Hobsbawm. Where would he sit if, what would he do the day after the revolution happened? And my view was that he always felt that the communist fields were greener on the other side, but I reckon he would have been the first to be put to death by a totalitarian thinker the next day, because the totalitarian wouldn't have wanted a person like Hobsbawm, and I see that as a short-sightedness on his part.
On that note, I'll bring this evening's discussion to an end, although there will be wine and soft drinks in the cafe area afterwards. Sadly, those joining us online can't join in. But if you have questions, then we can carry on the discussion. What I'd like to do to end is to thank you all for coming. And I'd also like to say how far you've travelled. So Henry's travelled from Cheshire, from the Wirral, and I think that's quite a distance, but he's travelled the least far of anyone here. So Maria's travelled from Durham, Johnny has travelled from Dublin,
Yes.
and Kay's travelled from Denmark. And that shows a real commitment, as you've all shown a commitment tonight, and those who've joined us online, to this kind of subject, to this kind of scholarship. And I think it's tremendously important that we come together and discuss ideas like this, discuss Berlin and discuss Arendt and discuss things like liberty. So I'd like to thank you all very, very much for your contribution. And let's go and enjoy a drink now. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.